So there are various possibilities during this last process where we apply the legislation to the concrete facts in front of us. So of course, in this instance, the constitution will also play a very, very important role. So it might come into play and maybe change that final result because of the constitution, because the result cannot conflict with the constitution. So if you can save it, you must do it. Okay, so it might be that when you do try and match what the legislation with this case in front of you to get to the purpose of to fulfill the purpose of the legislation, that there's absolutely no problem. And this happens in most cases, in fact, in our everyday life. So it's only the problematic cases that ever really comes to court. So in most instances, there will not be problems between knowing what the legislation is and applying it to the concrete facts and to get a certain outcome. And this often happens automatically. Okay. But what do we do when you do need to modify? So now the modification of the meaning is necessary. And this is often when the initial meaning of the text does not correspond with the purpose of the legislation. So now you have to start make a plan on how you're going to modify the text within the boundaries of the law and of the rules of interpretation to give effect to the purpose of the legislation. Text either provides for more or less than its purpose, and then also the initial meaning might be in conflict with the Constitution. If it is possible to modify, then one of two things will probably happen. You will either restrict the interpretation. Okay, so you will say, yes, this law can mean X, Y, and Z, but Y and Z will be unconstitutional, so we restrict the meaning just to X. Or you can extend it. You can say, well, it actually only says X, but maybe Y and Z is also included here. When will we do this? Well, again, when it's ambiguous, when it's unclear, when it seems absurd, when the initial meaning will not give effect to the purpose of the legislation, but also very important, lawmaking is the exception to the rule. Okay, so this will not happen in every case, as I've said before. So how do we do a restrictive interpretation? There are certain rules there. So what we do here, as I've said before, is words of the particular legislation embrace more than its purpose, then you have to restrict this purpose. So you modify the meaning to give effect to the true purpose. The first rule is the justem generis rule. So this say of the same kind. So if I use the example of earlier before, the courts will say, well, or the legislation will say fruits, including bananas and apples, then you can say, well, in this instance, we can argue that oranges are included because it speaks of fruits and it lists specific fruits. So the meaning of the words is qualified by the relationship to other words. And that orange will be qualified because of the relationship to bananas and apples as being a fruit. So there will be one category, a genus, of things, which is the fruit and all the things that belong to it. The specific words must not have exhausted the genus. So if that said fruits including and it listed all the possible fruits there is, then you cannot make use of this. And the order in which the words occur is not important. Okay, so that's the justem generis rule. The other rule is the cessante ratione leges cessante et ipsa lex rule. So that is the rule that says if the reason for the law ceases, the law itself also falls away. So it remains on the books, but it must be repealed because only the common law will stop being applicable from disuse, but it suspends the operation. So the courts might say there was a law that made provision for the 2010 football that in certain instances certain roads will be closed and it's not been repealed, then we say, well, the reason for the law ceased to exist because we no longer have the 2010 football, and then it falls away, but it must still be repealed by the legislature before it's off the books. Okay, so you restrict there. Extensive interpretation says in the instances where the purpose is broader than the initial textual meaning of the legislation. So you have to extend the meaning to give effect to the purpose. And the biggest one here is interpretation by implication. So you imply certain things are included in the list or in the interpretation, and by making use of these specific rules. So the specific rules is the ex contrariis rule that say implications arise from opposites. So if the legislation provides for a particular circumstance, then by implication it provides the contrary for the opposite circumstances. So I'm thinking here of legislation that says drinks may be sold, all drinks, including non-alcoholic drinks. Then you can probably use this to say that in this instance, if it provides for the sale of non-alcoholic goods, it might not provide for the sale of alcoholic goods. Okay, but it will depend on the context. Ex consequentibus, if the legislation demands or allows certain result, then everything that's necessary to get that result will be implied. It is often to do with the making of things. The ex acacia rule, if the principal thing is forbidden, then everything else that's accessory to it will also be forbidden or permitted. The a natura rule, implied or inherent relationship. So the power to issue a regulation, for instance, we assume implies also the power to withdraw it. Municipal or mutual, or reciprocal relationships, reciprocal, says that the prohibiting the purpose of certain things include the prohibition of the sale of goods. So if you say you are not allowed to buy marijuana, it implies that you are also not allowed to sell it. Okay, and then the last one is the interpretation by analogy. And an analogy is just if you say, well, if that was allowed there, then analogous to that, that's a very similar situation that's not provided for in legislation, it can also be applicable in this situation because there's the correlation. Okay. If no modification of meaning is possible, that means that the court's discretion is quite limited. If the purpose is not clear or does not support a modification, the legislature needs to rectify this. So there is a point where this process will end and where the courts will have to say it's not possible to modify this, or it's not possible to modify to give effect to the purpose, and therefore it needs to go back to the legislature.